The telephone call came at 2:47 a.m. on Thursday, June 15, 1950, and Marcus Big Mark Washington's voice contained urgency that Bumpy Johnson had heard only 3 times before in their 12-year association. "Sudding simply, boss. It's Mayme. You need to get to Harlem Hospital right now. She's alive, but it's bad." Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was 44 years old in June 1950, had been married to Mayme Johnson for 19 months. Since their October 1948 wedding and the 23-second drive from their Lenox Terrace apartment to Harlem. Hospital's emergency entrance was filled with the kind of focused calm that preceded extreme violence, because Johnson understood that someone had attacked his wife, and that whoever was responsible would experience consequences so severe that every criminal organization in New York would discuss the retaliation for decades afterward as cautionary tale about the fatal error of targeting families of powerful men. Mayme Johnson was 35 years old, had worked as waitress and hostess before marrying Bumpy, and represented the one aspect of Johnson's life that remained untouched by the violence and corruption that defined his professional existence as Harlem's dominant numbers, gambling operator, and de facto political power broker whose approval was required for virtually any significant criminal or legitimate business activity in the neighborhood. The scene at Harlem Hospital's trauma ward was controlled chaos, with 6 nurses and 3 doctors working simultaneously on Mayme, who lay unconscious on examination table with injuries so extensive that Dr. Patricia Morrison, who was supervising the emergency response, told Johnson immediately upon his arrival at 3:11 a.m. that his wife had survived something that should have killed her, and that the next 72 hours would determine whether she would live or die, and if she lived, whether she would recover full function or remain permanently disabled from trauma that had destroyed approximately 40% of her skin surface and caused internal injuries that might require multiple surgeries to repair if she remained stable long enough for surgical intervention to be attempted. The preliminary assessment that Dr. Morrison provided while nurses cut away Mayme's blood-soaked clothing revealed that she had been dragged behind a vehicle for distance estimated at between 4 and 6 miles based on the extent of road rash covering her back, legs, arms, and portions of her torso, that she had suffered compound fractures to her left leg and right arm from impacts against pavement or other hard surfaces during the ordeal, that she had severe concussion with possible skull fractured from her head repeatedly striking ground as she was pulled along, and that she had internal bleeding in her abdomen requiring immediate surgical exploration to identify and control the source before blood loss reached levels incompatible with survival. Johnson stood beside the examination table holding Mayme's uninjured right hand, while medical personnel worked around him cutting away clothing, starting intravenous lines, administering pain medication and fluids, and preparing her for emergency surgery. And he spoke quietly to his unconscious wife, saying, "Mayme, I'm here. You're going to be fine. And whoever did this to you is going to pay in ways they can't imagine." This promise was delivered in tone so devoid of emotion that the 2 nurses closest to Johnson stopped their work momentarily, because the absolute conviction in his voice communicated that he meant every word and that nothing would prevent him from executing whatever revenge he was already planning in the part of his mind that remained coldly operational, even while the emotional part processed the horror of seeing his wife's brutalized body and imagining the suffering she had endured during however many minutes she had been conscious while being dragged behind the vehicle that had created these catastrophic injuries. Big Mark Washington stood in the hallway outside the trauma ward with Raymond Quickdraw, Carter, and Samuel Chune, who had all been summoned by the same 911 call that had brought Johnson to the hospital, and Washington provided the limited information that was currently available, explaining that Mayme had been found at 2:23 a.m. by taxi driver named William Henderson, who had been driving north on Amsterdam Avenue when he noticed what appeared to be a body lying in the middle of 147th Street, approximately 70 yards west of the intersection with Amsterdam. Henderson had stopped his taxi and discovered Mayme semi-conscious and severely injured, had immediately driven her the 12 blocks to Harlem Hospital, rather than waiting for ambulance that might have taken precious minutes to arrive, and had provided hospital staff with the clothing fragments and rope pieces that had been tangled in Mayme's torn dress, suggesting she had been bound and dragged rather than struck by hit-and-run vehicle or injured through accidental collision. The rope fragments were particularly significant because they showed distinctive braiding pattern and had what appeared to be blood and tissue embedded in the fibers, indicating they had been used to bind Mayme while she was being dragged, and Raymond Carter had already photographed the rope using the Kodak camera he carried for documenting. Evidenthan had sent one of Johnson's intelligence operatives to canvass hardware, stores and marine supply shops throughout the Bronx, Queens, and Manhattan, looking for matching rope that might help identify where the rope had been purchased and potentially who had bought it if store owners maintained customer records or remembered unusual purchases. Samuel Chun was coordinating with 7 different informants who had various connections to white supremacist organizations operating in New York, including the Northern Brotherhood, klavern of the Ku Klux Klan, that had been conducting protection racket operations targeting black-owned businesses in Harlem for approximately 9 months since September 1949, when 12 white men from Queens and Yonkers decided that black economic success represented threat requiring organized terroristic response that would remind uppity colored people of their subordinate position in racial hierarchy that nature and God had supposedly ordained. If you've ever witnessed someone receive news so devastating that the immediate response is not emotional collapse, but rather intensely focused operational thinking about how to identify and eliminate threats through systematic application of overwhelming violence, subscribe and comment about moments when personal tragedy transforms into catalyst for actions that reshape entire landscapes of power and fear. Because what Bumpy Johnson planned over the next 48 hours would demonstrate that attacking his wife was not strategic intimidation tactic, but rather catastrophic miscalculation that would cost the perpetrators not only their lives but would destroy their organization so thoroughly that KKK operations in Harlem would effectively end for next 20 years. Mayme Johnson was taken into emergency surgery at 4:17 a.m. Thursday, with Dr. Harold Chun performing laparotomy to explore her abdominal cavity and identify sources of internal bleeding that preliminary X-rays suggested were causing blood to accumulate in her peritoneal space at rate that would eventually produce fatal hemorrhagic shock, if not controlled, through surgical intervention. The surgery lasted 3 hours and 47 minutes, during which Dr. Chun repaired lacerated spleen that had been torn when Mayme's body struck, raised pavement edge or curb during the dragging, sutured bleeding vessels in her mesentery that had been damaged by blunt force trauma, removed approximately 1 liter of accumulated blood from her abdomen, and verified that her other organs, including liver, kidneys, intestines, and bladder, had not sustained injuries requiring immediate repair. Though all showed bruising consistent with severe blunt trauma that would need careful monitoring over coming days to ensure no delayed complications like organ rupture or infection developed. While Mayme was in surgery, Johnson met with his complete organizational leadership in small conference room that hospital administrator had provided, after Johnson explained that he needed private space to conduct business, and that refusing this request would create problems that the administrator would prefer to avoid. The meeting included Big Mark Washington, who commanded enforcement operations, Raymond Carter, who ran intelligence gathering, Samuel Chun, who handled financial operations and money laundering, Patricia Williams, who managed relationships with legitimate businesses and political figures, and 7 other senior lieutenants who controlled various aspects of Johnson's gambling empire, protection rackets, and semi-illegitimate enterprises that provided cover for criminal activities, while also generating substantial legal income that was reported to tax authorities and used to explain Johnson's visible wealth and lifestyle. Johnson spoke for approximately 11 minutes, explaining what had happened to Mayme, displaying photographs that Raymond Carter had taken of her injuries while she was being treated in the emergency ward, and outlining preliminary investigative plan that would identify who was responsible for the attack and where those people could be found so that retribution could be executed within 48 to 72 hours, depending on how quickly intelligence could be gathered and verified. The working assumption that Johnson presented to his leadership team was that the attack had been ordered by Walter Brennan, who led the Northern Brotherhood klavern, and who had been pressuring Johnson for 3 months to accept KKK presence in Harlem, and to pay tribute of 15% of gambling revenues in exchange for Brennan's organization not interfering with Johnson's operations through violence against his workers or customers. Johnson had rejected these demands, explaining to Brennan during their only face meeting in March 1950 that Harlem's criminal operations were controlled by black gangsters who had fought Italian and Jewish mobs for territorial control during the 1930s, and who were not going to surrender authority to white supremacist organization regardless of what threats Brennan made or what violence his klavern attempted to inflict. That March meeting had ended with Brennan warning Johnson that refusing to cooperate would result in consequences that would make Johnson regret his arrogance and his failure to understand that white men would ultimately control Harlem just as they controlled every other aspect of American society where racial hierarchy placed whites at top and blacks at bottom, regardless of temporary aberrations like Johnson's current power that Brennan viewed as unnatural and ultimately unsustainable. Samuel Chun reported that his informants had confirmed within 90 minutes of Mayme's discovery that Walter Brennan had held emergency meeting of his klavern's inner circle at 11:30 p.m. Wednesday, approximately 3 hours before Mayme was found injured on 147th Street, and that 3 klavern members had left that meeting in a 1948 Ford pickup truck registered to Robert McCarthy, who was a 26-year-old unemployed veteran living in Yonkers with his widowed mother and who had been active in klavern operations, including 2 previous beatings of black men who had allegedly shown disrespect to white women by making eye contact or offering greetings that McCarthy interpreted as inappropriate familiarity. The timing of this meeting, followed by the discovery of Mayme's injuries, strongly suggested that Brennan had ordered an attack designed to intimidate Johnson into accepting KKK authority, though it remained unclear whether Brennan had specifically targeted Mayme or whether the attack had been an opportunistic response to finding her walking alone on Wednesday evening when she left a church meeting at St. Martin's Episcopal on Lenox Avenue, where she volunteered twice weekly, helping organize charitable activities and community outreach programs. The investigation over the following 18 hours combined traditional detective work with the kind of aggressive interrogation techniques that police couldn't employ but that Johnson's organization used routinely when gathering intelligence about threats or rivals. Raymond Carter's team located the 1948 Ford pickup truck at 11:47 a.m. Thursday, parked behind Robert McCarthy's mother's house in Yonkers. An examination of the vehicle revealed rope fragments matching those found tangled in Mayme's dress, bloodstains on the rear bumper and tailgate, consistent with someone being dragged behind the truck, and tire wear patterns that matched photographs Carter had taken of tire tracks found near where Mayme had been discovered. This physical evidence confirmed that McCarthy's truck had been used in the attack, though it didn't definitively prove who had been driving or how many people had participated in planning and executing the operation against Samuel Chun's network of informants, which included 2 people who had infiltrated the Northern Brotherhood klavern as probationary members, while actually working for Johnson, provided detailed intelligence by 6:30 p.m. Thursday, identifying 12 specific individuals who had either directly participated in Mayme's abduction and dragging, or who had provided logistical support, including planning the route, serving as lookouts, and ensuring that no witnesses interfered during the attack that had apparently lasted approximately 43 minutes from when Mayme left St. Martin's Episcopal at 9:47 p.m. Wednesday until she was found by taxi driver William Henderson at 2:23 a.m. Thursday. The intelligence indicated that the attack had been conceived as demonstration of KKK power that would force Johnson to recognize that his wife's safety depended on his cooperation with Brennan's demands, and that Brennan had specifically instructed his people to ensure Mayme survived the ordeal so that she could tell Johnson what had happened and who was responsible, creating psychological pressure that Brennan believed would overcome Johnson's resistance to paying tribute and accepting subordinate status to white supremacist organization. Have you ever seen miscalculation so profound that attackers fail to understand that what they intended as intimidation would actually trigger response? So overwhelming it would destroy their entire organization and establish precedent that would deter similar attacks for generations. If you recognize how strategic errors compound when people misread their opponent's psychology and capabilities, hit like and subscribe, because Bumpy Johnson's response would demonstrate that some men value justice and revenge, more than they value strategic restraint or risk mitigation. Mayme Johnson emerged from surgery at 8:04 a.m. Thursday and was transferred to intensive care unit, where she remained, unconscious under effects of anesthesia and pain medication that Dr. Chun had ordered to keep her comfortable while her body began healing, process from the extensive surgical repairs and the massive trauma she had sustained. Dr. Morrison told Johnson at 9:15 a.m. that Mayme's condition was critical but stable, that the surgery had successfully controlled her internal bleeding, that her fractures had been set and would heal over several months with proper care, that her road rash injuries would require daily wound care and would likely leave permanent scarring across significant portions of her body, and that the greatest immediate risk was infection, which could develop in any of her numerous open wounds and spread, systemically producing septic shock that might prove fatal despite aggressive antibiotic treatment. The prognosis that Morrison provided was cautiously optimistic, suggesting that Mayme would probably survive and eventually recover most of her physical function, though she would require months of rehabilitation and would carry physical and psychological scars from the ordeal for the rest of her life. Johnson remained at Mayme's bedside until 2:30 p.m. Thursday, when Big Mark Washington informed him that the intelligence gathering was complete and that all 12 targets had been located and were under surveillance, pending Johnson's decision about timing and method for the retaliatory operation that everyone in the organization understood was inevitable and necessary, both to punish the specific individuals responsible for attacking Mayme and to send unmistakable message to Walter Brennan and every other white supremacist in New York that targeting Johnson's family carried consequences so severe that no rational person would ever repeat the mistake, regardless of how deeply they believed in white racial superiority or how much they black economic and political power. Johnson kissed Mayme's forehead, told her unconscious form that he would return soon after handling some business that required his personal attention, and left Harlem Hospital accompanied by Washington and Carter, heading to the restaurant on Lenox Avenue, where the detailed operational planning would occur. The planning session began at 3:15 p.m. Thursday and lasted 2 hours and 33 minutes, during which Johnson and his leadership team developed comprehensive plan for simultaneously capturing all 12 klavern members who had participated in the attack on Mayme, transporting them to secure location, where they could be executed without witnesses or police interference, and disposing of their bodies in ways that would maximize public impact while minimizing investigative leads that might connect the executions to Johnson's organization. The plan required coordinating 12 four-person teams who would strike their assigned targets at precisely 3 a.m. Saturday morning, approximately 49 hours after Mayme had been found injured, giving intelligence operatives adequate time to finalize surveillance and confirm that targets were at expected locations, but not so much time that word might spread about impending retaliation, allowing targets to flee or increase security measures that would complicate captures. The execution site that Johnson selected was the same abandoned meat warehouse in the South Bronx where 4 years earlier, in 1946, his organization had conducted similar mass execution of 7 rival numbers operators who had attempted to muscle into Harlem's gambling territories through violent intimidation campaign that had killed 3 of Johnson's collectors and wounded 12 others, before Johnson responded by systematically eliminating everyone involved in the unauthorized incursion. The warehouse remained abandoned and isolated, with no nearby residential areas where screams might be heard or where curious neighbors might investigate unusual activity, and the building's interior still contained the steel support beams and overhead track systems that would serve perfectly for hanging 12 bodies in theatrical display that would invoke lynching imagery, sending psychological message that black communities could respond to racial terrorism with equivalent violence that turned historical tools of white supremacist oppression against the oppressors themselves. The simultaneous captures executed beginning at 3 a.m. Saturday, June 17th proceeded with efficiency that reflected both careful planning and the operational experience that Johnson's people had developed through years of conducting violent operations against rivals who typically possessed their own security measures and tactical capabilities. The 12 four-person teams struck within a 19-minute window from 2:57 a.m., when the first team initiated contact through 3:16 a.m. when the last target was secured, and the operations varied in complexity depending on whether targets were sleeping alone in isolated residences or were protected by family members or associates who might interfere with captures or alert authorities before teams could extract their prisoners and depart the area. 3 of the 12 targets attempted various forms of resistance, including Robert McCarthy, who barricaded himself in his bedroom and fired 6 shots from a revolver through the door before being subdued when Johnson's enforcers breached the room using sledgehammer and McCarthy through superior numbers and training that allowed them to disarm and restrain him without killing him, because Johnson's explicit instructions required all targets to be brought alive to the warehouse for execution. Walter Brennan was captured at his Queens residence after a brief firefight during which his 2 bodyguards were killed, and Brennan himself was wounded by a shotgun blast to his right thigh that shattered his femur but didn't kill him because the enforcer who fired had been specifically instructed to incapacitate rather than execute, since Johnson wanted Brennan alive to watch his followers die before experiencing his own execution. The wound required immediate field treatment to prevent Brennan from bleeding to death during transport, and one of Johnson's people who had received combat medical training during World War II applied tourniquet and pressure dressing that controlled the hemorrhage sufficiently for Brennan to survive the 90-minute journey to the Bronx warehouse, where he would spend his final hours witnessing the destruction of everything he had built through his Northern Brotherhood klavern. Transportation of the 12 captured klavern members to the warehouse was completed by 5:43 a.m. Saturday, with all prisoners arriving alive, though several had sustained injuries during capture operations that required basic first aid to ensure they remained conscious and aware during the preparation and execution phases that Johnson had planned, with the same attention to symbolic detail and psychological impact that he applied to all operations that served purposes beyond immediate tactical objectives. Each prisoner was stripped to the waist, had hands bound behind back with the same type of rope that had been used to drag Mayme, and was positioned beneath one of 12 steel support beams, from which nooses had been suspended at heights calculated to ensure death would occur through strangulation lasting several minutes rather than through immediate cervical fracture that would have produced rapid unconsciousness and relatively painless death that Johnson considered completely inappropriate for men who had inflicted extended suffering on his wife. Johnson addressed the 12 captured men at 6:27 a.m. Saturday, speaking in the same controlled tone he had used when promising Mayme that her attackers would pay for what they had done, explaining that they were going to be executed as punishment for attacking his wife, and that their deaths would serve dual purposes of delivering justice for that specific crime and warning every white supremacist in the northeastern United States that future attacks against black families connected to powerful criminals would trigger retaliation so overwhelming that no organization could survive and no individual could escape, regardless of how carefully they planned or how well they hid after committing their crimes. Johnson then displayed photographs showing Mayme's injuries in the Harlem hospital emergency ward, forcing each captured man to look at the images and understand exactly what suffering they had caused and exactly why they were about to die in ways that would mirror the pain and terror they had inflicted on an innocent woman whose only crime had been walking home from church meeting on Wednesday evening. Several of the captured men broke down crying or vomited while viewing the photographs, and 3 attempted to claim they had only followed orders from Walter Brennan and hadn't personally wanted to hurt anyone but had participated because refusing would have resulted in them being expelled from the klavern or targeted for punishment by Brennan, who didn't tolerate dissent or disobedience from his subordinates. Johnson rejected these justifications, explaining that adults who chose to join terrorist organizations and who participated in attacks on innocent people bore full responsibility for their actions, regardless of who gave orders or what consequences might have followed from refusing those orders, and that claiming to merely follow instructions was excuse that had been thoroughly discredited during Nuremberg trials, where Nazi war criminals discovered that obeying orders didn't absolve them of moral or legal responsibility for atrocities they committed. Walter Brennan maintained defiant silence during Johnson's speech, refusing to show emotion or acknowledge any regret for ordering the attack on Mayme. And this stubborn pride seemed to provide some psychological comfort to the other captured men, who looked to their leader for guidance about how to face their approaching deaths, until Brennan's facade collapsed during the execution phase, when he watched his 11 followers die one by one. Understanding that his miscalculation about Johnson's psychology had been so profound that it had destroyed not only these men's lives, but it effectively ended KKK operations in Harlem for a foreseeable future, because no white supremacist organization would dare attempt to reconstitute operations after witnessing the overwhelming violence that Johnson was demonstrating through this public execution. The executions began at 7:34 a.m. Saturday, with 11 klavern members, excluding Walter Brennan, being divided into 2 groups of 5 and 6, who would be hanged simultaneously in waves, allowing Johnson to manage logistics, while ensuring that each death was properly documented through photographs that would be distributed throughout New York's criminal underworld as evidence of what happened to people who attacked Johnson's family. The first group of 6 was positioned beneath their assigned support beams, with nooses placed around necks and adjusted to ensure strangulation would proceed at a pace that maximized suffering without allowing any possibility of escape or survival. And at Johnson signaled, his enforcers pulled ropes that lifted the 6 bodies off ground, causing immediate panic as the men struggled against nooses, while their oxygen-deprived brains processed the reality that they were dying and that nothing could save them from the prolonged strangulation that would continue for several minutes until cardiovascular collapse finally ended their consciousness and their lives. The dying process took between 5 minutes, 11 seconds for the lightest man to 9 minutes 47 seconds for the heaviest, and Johnson watched each death with the same focused attention he had applied when planning the operation, ensuring that justice was being properly executed, and that the symbolic and psychological messages he intended to communicate were being delivered through the theatrical spectacle of mass hanging that deliberately invoked imagery of racial violence that white supremacists had employed against black victims for generations. When all 6 bodies hung lifeless from their support beams, Johnson ordered 15-minute pause while photographers documented the scene from multiple angles, creating visual record that would be shared with law enforcement, media organizations, and criminal groups throughout the region as evidence of what had occurred and as warning about consequences of targeting families of powerful black criminals who possessed resources and determination to exact comprehensive revenge regardless of tactical risks or strategic costs. The second group of 5 was hanged, beginning at 8:23 a.m., using identical procedures that produced similar results, with dying times ranging from 4 minutes 53 seconds to 8 minutes 32 seconds, depending on individual physical characteristics and struggle intensity. And again Johnson witnessed each death, maintaining the same emotionless observation that allowed him to ensure the operation achieved its intended purposes without being distracted by any sympathy for men who had forfeited any claim to mercy when they participated in dragging his wife behind truck 4 miles of conscious suffering that had nearly killed her and that would have killed most people who experienced equivalent trauma. When all 11 klavern members hung dead from the warehouse support beams, Johnson finally turned his attention to Walter Brennan, who would receive individualized execution after being forced to witness the deaths of his entire leadership team and to contemplate his own approaching death, while understanding that his fundamental miscalculation about power dynamics in Johnson's psychology had been so catastrophic that it had cost not only his own life, but the lives of everyone who had trusted his judgment and followed his orders. If you were as shocked as New York's white supremacist organizations by this demonstration of how systematic execution of justice through methods deliberately designed to invoke historical imagery of lynching violence could send psychological message powerful enough to deter future terrorism and reshape calculations about costs and benefits of targeting black families, hit that subscribe button and tell us in comments whether you've seen other examples of retribution that combine symbolic messaging with tactical precision to achieve both immediate revenge and long-term strategic deterrence. Johnson spoke directly to Brennan for approximately 6 minutes, explaining that Brennan's era had been believing that threatening Johnson's wife would force submission rather than triggering wrath that would consume Brennan's entire organization, and that this miscalculation reflected fundamental misunderstanding of how powerful men respond when their families are targeted by enemies, who mistake tactical restraint for weakness, or who believe that criminal enterprises operate according to cost-benefit calculations that would counsel accepting subordination rather than risking destructive warfare. Johnson repeated Mayme's full name 11 times during his final remarks to Brennan, ensuring that Brennan's last conscious thoughts would be dominated by recognition that the woman whose attack he had ordered was a real person whose suffering had triggered consequences that had destroyed everything Brennan had worked to build over the previous 9 months since founding the Northern Brotherhood klavern, with ambitions of establishing major white supremacist presence in Harlem that would extend KKK influence beyond traditional Southern strongholds into northern urban environments where changing demographics supposedly created opportunities for organized racist response. The noose was placed around Brennan's neck at 8:47 a.m., and the rope was pulled at 8:49 a.m., lifting his 196-pound body off ground and beginning strangulation that lasted 10 minutes and 33 seconds, making Brennan's death the longest and presumably most agonizing of all 12 executions. And Johnson maintained eye contact with Brennan throughout the entire process, ensuring that the last thing Brennan saw before losing consciousness was Johnson's face displaying expression that communicated absolute conviction that this execution represented just a necessary response to unforgivable crime. Johnson left the warehouse at 9:07 a.m. Saturday, approximately 55 hours after Mayme had been found injured on 147th Street, and he made an anonymous telephone call to New York Police Department reporting that 12 bodies could be found at specific address, along with information that the dead men were KKK members who had been executed in retaliation for attacking Bumpy Johnson's wife in racially motivated assault that had nearly killed her. The discovery of the 12 bodies at 11:23 a.m. Saturday by NYPD officers responding to Johnson's anonymous tip created immediate media sensation as newspapers competed to publish most sensational coverage of what became known as the Bronx warehouse executions, with headlines emphasizing that 12 KKK members had been hanged in apparent retaliation for attacking wife of Harlem's most powerful black criminal. The New York Times ran front-page story on Sunday, June 18th, describing the crime scene in detail and noting that preliminary investigation suggested the executions had been professionally planned and executed by organization with significant resources, and the article included brief interviews with Harlem residents who expressed satisfaction that white supremacist terrorists had finally faced consequences for crimes against black community that police and courts had historically ignored or minimized through selective prosecution favoring white perpetrators. The Amsterdam News published special edition on Sunday with banner headline, "Justice Delivered. KKK Terrorists Executed After Brutal Attack on Harlem Woman," and provided comprehensive coverage of both the attack on Mayme Johnson and the subsequent executions, while editorial content explicitly praised the response as appropriate and necessary, given the failure of legal institutions to protect black citizens from racial terrorism. The Daily News published sensational coverage emphasizing graphic details and photographs of the warehouse exterior while treating the as evidence of escalating gang warfare between black and white criminal organizations, and the coverage generated substantial newsstand sales and public interest in story that combined elements of racial conflict, organized crime, and vigilante justice that fascinated readers regardless of their political orientations or views on appropriate responses to terrorism. The police investigation that followed discovery of the 12 bodies was complicated by lack of witnesses willing to provide information about Johnson's involvement and by recognition among law enforcement officials that prosecuting Johnson for killing KKK members who had brutally attacked his wife would be politically difficult and might trigger public backlash from Harlem's black community who viewed the executions as justified revenge. Detective Lieutenant Thomas O'Brien, who led the investigation, told his superiors that gathering sufficient evidence to secure convictions would require cooperation from witnesses who clearly weren't going to testify, and that pursuing charges would likely fail in court while simultaneously creating perception that police were protecting white supremacist terrorists at expense of black victims, whose only recourse to justice came through extra-legal means that the community supported. The investigation ultimately concluded without arrests being filed, despite general consensus that Bumpy Johnson had organized and directed and this outcome reflected pragmatic recognition that the legal system's historical failure to protect black citizens from racial violence had created a situation where vigilante justice was both inevitable and arguably necessary to establish deterrent effects that conventional law enforcement apparently couldn't or wouldn't create. The decision not to pursue charges was also influenced by recognition that 12 dead KKK members represented elimination of terrorist organization that police had struggled to infiltrate or suppress through normal, investigative methods, and that Johnson had effectively solved problem that law enforcement had failed to address through proper channels. Subscribe for more stories about how systematic execution of justice sent messages powerful enough to permanently alter calculations that white supremacist organizations made about targeting black families and communities. Tell us whether you've seen other examples of vigilante justice that achieved deterrent effects impossible through conventional legal processes. Mayme Johnson regained consciousness on Sunday, June 18, approximately 60 hours after her surgery, and her first question to the nurse attending her was whether Bumpy was safe and whether he had done anything that would result in his arrest or imprisonment. The nurse contacted Dr. Morrison, who informed Johnson that his wife was awake and asking for him, and Johnson arrived at the hospital within 17 minutes of receiving the message. The reunion between Bumpy and Mayme lasted approximately 4 minutes, during which she learned that she would survive and eventually recover most of her physical function, though she would carry scars from the attack, and he explained without providing specific details that the people responsible for hurting her had been held accountable and would never threaten anyone again. Mayme understood what this meant without requiring explicit explanation, and she told Bumpy that while she didn't condone violence, she recognized that some situations demanded responses that transcended normal moral constraints, and that she trusted his judgment about what actions had been necessary to protect both her specifically and the broader Harlem community that depended on him to maintain order and defend against external threats. Mayme's recovery required 3 months of hospitalization, followed by 6 months of intensive physical rehabilitation, during which she gradually regained mobility and strength that had been compromised by her injuries and extended bed rest. The physical scars from the road rash covered approximately 38% of her body's surface and remained visible for the rest of her life, serving as permanent reminder of the attack and the retaliation it had triggered, though Mayme rarely discussed the incident publicly, preferring to focus on her charitable work and community activities rather than dwelling on trauma that had shaped but not defined her life. She lived for 59 more years after the attack, dying in May 2009 at age 94. Having outlived Bumpy by 41 years, and having spent her later decades preserving his legacy through her 2008 memoir, Harlem Godfather, that provided comprehensive account of his life and career, including brief mention of the 1950 incident that had demonstrated the lengths he would go to protect his family and deliver justice when legal institutions failed. The long-term impact of the Bronx warehouse executions extended far beyond immediate elimination of the Northern Brotherhood klavern to reach how white supremacist organizations calculated risks and benefits of operating in black urban neighborhoods where criminal groups possessed resources and determination to respond to terrorism with overwhelming violence. No significant KKK operations were attempted in Harlem for 2 decades after 1950, as news of Johnson's retaliation spread throughout white supremacist networks, creating consensus that targeting families of powerful black criminals invited consequences so severe that no rational organization would accept those risks, regardless of ideological commitments or racial resentments that might otherwise motivate terrorist activities. The executions became cautionary tale, studied by both criminals and law enforcement as example of how extralegal violence could achieve deterrent effects that conventional policing and prosecution apparently couldn't create, when institutional racism prevented legal system from protecting black citizens or punishing white perpetrators who attacked them. The story of how 12 KKK members died after attacking Bumpy Johnson's wife became one of Harlem's most retold narratives, demonstrating both the protective power that organized crime could provide to black communities and the terrible costs that came from triggering vengeance of men like Johnson, who valued family more than strategic restraint or risk mitigation. People who told the story emphasized that Mayme had survived the attack and lived long, healthy life, rather than focusing exclusively on the violent revenge that had followed. And they noted that Johnson's response had been both proportional to the crime and strategically calibrated to send messages that would prevent future attacks without triggering broader racial warfare that might have harmed innocent people throughout Harlem who had no connection to criminal activities. The executions stood as testament to the complexity of justice in communities where legal institutions failed to protect citizens, leaving them dependent on extra-legal power structures that combined criminal violence with community protection in ways that challenged simple moral judgments about right and wrong, good and evil, justice and revenge.